What is up, plant people? Hey, today is May the 4th, 2021. We're back with another episode of the Plant Anthropology Podcast, the show where we dive into the lives and careers and overall awesomeness of some really cool plant and nature people. I'm Vikram Baliga, your host, and today is time for another replay episode. So I had planned on having a new episode for you today, and I'd planned on having a new Plants and World Traditions episode for you last week, but you know what? It is a final season here at Texas Tech University, and we had a plant sale on Saturday, and all of my bones still hurt. And so it didn't happen. That happens sometimes, right? You know, life happens. So you'll get the episode of Plants and World Traditions that was supposed to be last week at the end of May. And today I'm pulling out another one of my favorites from the back catalog, and this was episode 10, more than a year ago, y'all, which is kind of crazy for me to say. This was more than a year ago, and this was an episode where we did a crossover with Ellen Weatherford, who is a dear friend of mine. I'm just so grateful for Ellen and for her friendship. She's been an inspiration in the podcast world, and she's just a great friend and really a cool human. So she's the host of the Just the Zoo of Us podcast, which is wonderful. And if you haven't listened to it, you got to go do the thing. Go do the thing, y'all. But we talked in this episode about carnivorous plants, plants that have cool mutualistic relationships with insects and all other kinds of awesome things. And so it was a lot of fun. Again, this was episode 10, which was a billion years ago, it seems like. But that's all I have to say. Follow us on the social medias. We're Plant Anthropology, all the places. Look for the cool bristlecone pine. Go follow Ellen on her social media, wherever you can find her. She's Just the Zoo of Us in all the places. And you will not regret doing either of those things. But without any other of my normal blabbering, here is a replay of episode 10 with Ellen Weatherford from Just the Zoo of Us. And I know you're going to love it. So settle in, have a good listen, and we'll talk to you soon with a brand new content. So y'all are cool. Hang in there. I hope May's going well for you. And get ready once more for a replay of episode 10 with my friend Ellen Weatherford. All right. Well, we are live and ready for another episode of Plant Anthropology. I have Ellen Weatherford from the Just the Zoo of Us podcast on today. We're kind of doing something a little bit different than normal and talking about animals some. And we're going to a little bit follow the format of her show, which is really exciting. So, Ellen, how are you this morning?
I'm great, and I'm really excited to be talking to y'all. I've been listening to a lot of Plant Anthropology, and even though I feel like of all of the guests that you've had on so far, I'm probably the most boring.
That is so untrue. That's like massively untrue.
Well, like, a lot of the people that you have on are like academics or like, professionals in plant-related fields. And then there's me, some rando from Florida.
Well, that's okay. I like Florida. There's plants in Florida. You know what? I have had the goal kind of since I started this of, a big part of what we do is interview academics and those kinds of folks. But I kind of want to talk to everyone that is interested. I want to have people from all kinds of fields because none of this stuff that we talk about exists in a vacuum. And I think it's really cool to be able to talk like we're going to today about some of the relationships between plants and animals and some of that kind of stuff and some of the weird plants that are out there too.
Yeah. So I'm a recent sort of convert to Team Plant. I think that, I've always had a bigger focus on animals, but when you're learning about animals, you have to also learn about the plant kingdom too, right? Because we're all sharing the same ecosystem. And so like I'm about to talk about, there are some really, really interesting relationships that animals have with plants, not just in the sense that like, oh yeah, they're herbivores, so they eat plants, but they're using plants in really interesting ways that I think until really digging into that stuff, I kind of only thought that humans were the ones doing it, but you see some surprisingly advanced agricultural techniques, even as far down as the invertebrates, right? Like you see bugs and all sorts of things that you wouldn't really expect to have these almost technological innovations, but you're seeing them on such a little teeny tiny little animal scale. You don't even expect that they would have like functioning brains and stuff, and yet they have these like sprawling farms. So it's really, really cool.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's fascinating, and so I want to get into that. And I know you've done a little bit of research on just some of these commensal and relationships between plants and animals. But before we dive in too much to that, tell me a little bit about your show. Tell our listeners a little bit about your show. I've been listening for a little while now, and I really enjoy it. I'm a plant lover too. I mean, I'm sorry, I am a plant lover, but I'm an animal lover too, and I've just learned so much listening to you and Christian just deep dive into different animals.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear you say that. Yeah, so it is usually me and my husband, Christian, and we sit down together, and what we do, it's called Just the Zoo of Us. I'm sorry, I don't know if that had been mentioned yet.
I can't, maybe, I'm not sure.
So we sit down together, and each of us before the show picks a species of animal that we're going to talk about, except for one time when we talked about tardigrades, and that's like a whole phylum. So we had to like kind of zoom out there a little bit.
Right.
But usually we talk about a species of animals that we pick, and we do a lot of research and a lot of notes on the animal. And I'm sorry, that was my cat.
That's okay. There's a grad student washing his hands out in the hallway, so we've all got stuff.
We've all got our own audio struggles.
Yep.
But so we sit down, we do these notes on these animals, and then what we do is we each give the animal a score, a rating out of 10 in the categories of effectiveness, which is physical adaptations that the animal has that let it do a good job of the things it's trying to do, ingenuity, which is behavioral adaptations, which I think I'm going to kind of be talking a lot about today.
Right.
And then the last one is aesthetics, and that's just the arbitrary, purely opinion-based, what we think about looking at the animal and how nice it is to look at. So that's kind of like the more fun element where we just kind of like spin and give our own sort of personal opinions. And that's probably the one we get the most flack on, because that's where people usually disagree with us the most. But so, yeah, that's pretty much the gist of how we usually format talking about an animal on our show. Of course, with you right now, I'm just going to kind of give a broad overview of a few practices that I see in a few different types of animals. I didn't zoom in as much as I usually do on our show, but that's about how we usually do it. And like you said, like we have learned a lot just from doing this show, because we're not experts. We're not zoologists or biologists or anything. We're just kind of doing whatever research we can, which has led to some really interesting things that we've gotten to teach each other about animals that we thought we were really familiar with, and we ended up being like, oh, I didn't actually know all of the stuff about this animal. So it's just been really exciting for us and really fun to do, really great learning experience.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And it's, you get to, and you've had a few guests on, at least recently for sure. And it's really cool just getting to hear from different people and learn different things. And that's why I'm really excited about today's episode. And so one last question. I'm always interested talking to other podcasters, because it's such just I don't want to say it's a weird thing, but it's a weird thing that we do, right? We sit around and we
it is like having just like a one-sided conversation. Well, for me and Christian, it's us having a conversation with each other one-on-one in that moment, but a conversation that we know like many other people are going to listen to after the fact. So yeah, it is an interesting dynamic.
What made y'all want to do that? What was your like, we're going to start a podcast today? What was that for you?
Yeah, so we had really been bouncing the idea around for quite a while, because I've listened to podcasts since I was a kid. When I was probably about 11 or 12 years old, my mom got me into the This American Life podcast,
cool.
Which was followed by the Radio Lab podcast for me. And so I got really into those. And then I just followed them as I got older. And then I started to just get really, really into a lot of other, not just necessarily like science communication podcasts, but just like fun, like comedy and edutainment sort of style podcasts in general. So I had been really into them. And then I kind of got Christian into them, over the course of our relationship. And then we bounced around the idea of starting one, but we hadn't really landed on a concept or hadn't really found the like motivation to really pull the trigger on it until I think the beginning of 2019. Obviously we got married in the beginning of 2019 and we were like, okay, we should find a fun project for us to work on together. And I think like the most immediate sort of thing that was kind of what lit the fire under us was that we went out to Tallahassee. It was a work night. It was a Tuesday night, and we drove from Jacksonville to Tallahassee, which, if you don't know Florida geography very well, it's about a 4-hour drive there and then a 4-hour drive back.
Wow.
And we both had work in the morning.
Wow.
So we went out there. Okay. That was my cat again. Sorry. He's the worst.
No problem.
So we went out to Tallahassee to go to FSU, where Griffin McElroy was doing lecture. And we were just so inspired by it. He shared a lot of like his process and his creative motivation and just said some stuff that really made us feel very inspired to really pull the trigger on starting a podcast. And we were like, you know what? Like on the drive home, we were like, let's sit down and do it. Like, let's actually get around to really like setting a date and sitting down, doing notes and just hitting record. So we started recording actually in early April of 2019. And we sat down and hit record and did that 3 times. And we recorded 3 different episodes until we finally put them up in May of 2019. And then it just stuck. And we've been doing it ever since and getting better and better each time.
Well, that's awesome. And yeah, I'm really loving it. And it's funny how, you talk about Griffin McElroy. And for those of you out there that have not listened to any of the McElroy family podcasts, like My Brother and Me, they're wild, right? It's like, they're so weird and hilarious, but they're brilliant communicators. And I think that like, that's something that I found in this community is that it's taught me as a scientist and a science communicator to be so much better and just find new ways to get messaging out there. And it's cool that we get to, do stuff like this and make friends that, live states and, thousands of miles away and just talk about science and talk about other fun stuff. It's really cool.
Yeah, I have found it that, I've learned so much, not just about podcasting or about communication, but just about like how the world works in general. And that was really important to me growing up, like when I was a teenager and stuff, I would listen to This American Life and Radio Lab. And that was really where I got a lot of like exposure to the world. So I lived in the city called Green Cove Springs in Florida, which is, it's about a mile across. So, very small, very rural town, didn't have a lot of sort of perspective on the world outside of Green Cove. And so really just the accessibility of having podcasts that were, free to listen to. I didn't have to pay for them.
Right.
I could just download them off the internet for free and listen to them. And they just really expanded my worldview so much. So I think that was, I know the importance of it from my own experience growing up. And now I'm really excited because I'm starting to get feedback from people that I get to be that for. Like
Right.
I get to be that voice that's telling you like about cool things you may not have ever heard of before. And, people, that's like the thing that I think gets me the most fired up is when people give me feedback that say, hey, I learned something today from you. Thank you for teaching me that. I get really excited about that.
Yeah, that's super cool. and one more thing before we kind of jump into it, like we've talked about this before just on Twitter or whatever, but I am always still shocked when someone like just randomly comes up to me and is like, hey, I was listening to your show the other day. I'm like, what? Why? Don't do that. Why would you do that?
Have a brief panic attack.
Oh my gosh. And I have a background, I've spent a few years I'm not working in media, but working with the media through radio and TV and stuff. And for some reason, this is so much more just like personal in so many ways.
Oh yeah.
That when people say they're listening, I'm like, okay. Okay, I'm okay with this. This is okay.
Yeah, it's very like an intimate sort of feeling that you're like, oh my gosh, you like you put in headphones and had my voice beamed into your brain for an hour. Like it does feel weird. And I've had that moment a few times now where I've gone to meet somebody and I've introduced myself like, hi, it's nice to meet you. My name is Ellen. And they go, oh, I thought your voice sounded familiar. And I'm like, and then it gives me a brief panic attack every single time. I just have which is so counterintuitive to like how as a podcaster, a lot of times you just like, you feel desperately like you're begging people to listen to your show. And when they actually do, you're like, oh my gosh, what have I done?
No, stop it. Quit. Why are you doing
stop.
that?
I take it back.
I know. And that's one of those fun experiences that I think we can share as a, community of podcasters. But all right, well, let's jump into the fun stuff of this episode. So tell me what you learned and what you've kind of figured out about plant animal relationships.
So like I mentioned earlier, I am not myself like a zoological expert or anything. So over the as I've been preparing to talk about this, I've done some reading, and most of my reading has been from BBC Earth and National Geographic.
Okay.
So I just wanted to get that out there, that those are where I'm getting this information from. So the first animal that I really wanted to talk about is damselfish. So damselfish are reef-dwelling saltwater fish, and they eat algae, as many reef fish do. But so something really interesting that damselfish do is that in these coral reefs where they live, they have gardens of algae that they actually actively tend to by biting away chunks of rock and any sort of debris that lands in their garden area. So they take a bite out of this rock or debris or whatever it is, they swim away from their territory outside of their garden and spit it out. And actually, like it's kind of like you're tending to your garden, right? You're like cleaning it up, and what this does is this gives algae more room to grow.
Right.
But what they also do to make their garden healthy is they also are aggressively territorial, and they will not hesitate to immediately attack anything that threatens their algae.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. And these are not big fish, by the way. They are like little. So, but they have a big attitude. So they're not afraid to stand up for their algae. So this is a really cool symbiotic relationship in which the fish is protecting the algae, because the algae by itself is not very tough or hardy. It's pretty easy to kill. So the fish is, keeping it alive, and the algae is in turn providing a steady food source for the fish.
Wow, that's really cool. And that, that kind of sounds like a lot of gardeners I know too, that they're, aggressive about protecting their plants in their garden. But no, that's fascinating.
That's something you have to do. Like, you have to protect your garden from pests or from, any sort of outside invader that would come and threaten your plants.
Yeah.
And so the damselfish are doing the same thing, it's pretty funny to watch because they're very small, and it's funny to watch them kind of puff themselves up.
Well, and like as you're talking, I'm like making a list on a sticky pad of like things I need to YouTube later.
Yeah, it's pretty cute. Now, see, I am terrified of fish, actually. So like, I feel like it would take very little. The damselfish would probably just win that fight based on like intimidation alone. Like, it would just have to swim at me, and I would be like, "Yep, you're right. I'm out of here. Sorry,
nope.
I'll leave your garden alone."
That's funny.
So the next animal that I wanted to talk about is a salt marsh snail, also known as a marsh periwinkle.
Okay.
And this is something a little bit different. So the marsh periwinkle, it does hang out in like salt marsh cordgrass. And what it does with this cordgrass is really, really interesting. So snails have this structure inside of what I guess you would call their mouth. It is a tongue-like structure called a radula. And what they use this radula for is they actually scrape these grooves into the leaves of the cordgrass. And so once they've scraped these grooves into the cordgrass, they go back over it and they deposit excrement. There you go.
It's a good way to put that. Yeah.
Yes, they deposit excrement into the grooves in the grass. And what this does is this fertilizes a fungus that grows in the grooves that they have etched into the grass. And the fungus grows, and that's actually what they eat.
Wow.
Yeah. So they're not actually eating the grass. They're eating a fungus that they are intentionally they're not exactly planting it, but they're cultivating it in these sort of like, it's very analogous to like tilling soil, right?
Yeah.
They're cutting out an area for the fungus to grow in, and then they're nurturing it and letting it grow so that they can eat it.
That's so fascinating, and it's interesting you bring that up, because we're gonna circle back to that in a minute when we talk about carnivorous plants and the deposition of excrement. So we'll come back to this in a minute.
Yeah. So the next one is very similar to that. So that practice of like intentionally cultivating fungus for you to eat, that's called fungiculture. Or fungiculture, maybe. I don't know. I've never heard it pronounced out loud.
And it's weird to like think about, like to look at it and hear I'm not sure actually. Well,
either one. Here, I'll say it both ways, and you can keep in whichever one is correct. Fungiculture or fungiculture.
I love it.
So the next one is one that I think probably more people know about, but it's similar to this marsh periwinkle, and this is leafcutter ants. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people have probably heard of leafcutter ants because they are very, very impressive. These are the ones that have these massive, intricate colonies where, they have, into the structure of their colonies, they have all sorts of very like fascinating structures. They have like air conditioning vents almost.
Whoa.
Yeah, like they've dug their tunnels in such a way where the air flows through it, and in like such a unfortunately, I don't understand the aerodynamics behind it, but the air flows through it in such a way that it lowers the temperature inside the colony. It's really cool.
That's crazy.
Yeah, they're insanely smart. So these leafcutter ants, they spend their days cutting up and gathering these leaves, and then they carry them back into their massive, intricate colony. So if you're seeing them do this, you would probably reasonably assume that they're taking these leaves inside of their colony to eat them. But that's not the case. That's not what they're doing. So once they're back inside their colonies, they do crunch up the leaves. So it looks like they're eating them, but they're actually just using their mandibles to mash them up into a goop. And then they mix this goop up with their excrement and then spread that leaf poop mixture over these beds of fungus, and it fertilizes the fungus and helps it grow. And just like the damselfish that I talked about, they actually like actively take care of the fungus. They're like removing debris from it, they're pruning it, and like they're pruning away infected parts of it. And they actually, the body of the ant produces this antibiotic producing bacteria, and they actually will rub that bacteria onto the fungus to keep it like healthy and keep it from getting infected. So in return, the fungus produces these fruiting bodies that are really, really nutritionally dense, and that's what the ants eat.
Wow.
Yeah, so it seems like so many steps to get to that, right? Like it takes a lot.
Yeah. It's just so fascinating when you look at these coevolutions of, like you said earlier, something that you don't think of as, especially intelligent, like an insect.
Yeah, I think in ant colonies you find that where like individually each ant by itself is like dumb as a brick, but when they're all combined together, like as a unit, as a colony, they're incredibly smart.
Right.
But each one individually is not actually that smart. So I'm glad that you said coevolution, because what is really interesting is that those fruiting bodies that I mentioned, you don't find those in other similar strains of fungus.
Wow.
So what this indicates is that this type of fungus has actually adapted that as an incentive for the ants to take care of them. It's like they have really even like the fungus has even changed itself to have more to offer in this symbiotic relationship.
That's so crazy.
Yeah.
I feel like I keep saying the same thing, but like it's just mind-boggling, some of the stuff that like in these little microcosms of our environment. It's just incredible.
Yeah. So this is definitely something that it's easy to miss, because these ants are just so small. Right. And if you just see them carrying around leaves, you just assume, oh, they're just eating leaves. But it's so much more complicated and impressive than, oh, they're just eating leaves. And they're not the only ones that do this. So this whole practice of fungiculture, that's also shared by termites, and like a ton of different species of beetles do this too. So ambrosia beetles are known to do something very, very similar.
That's so cool.
Yeah. Hold on just one second. Let me get my cat out of here.
Okay.
He's driving me crazy.
No, but that's so fascinating that you think we think about a lot, especially in agriculture, of how I think we're real quick to like lump insects and other things into like pests, beneficials, and that's all there is, right? Like if it attacks your crop or it doesn't, and that's all. But there's these really nuanced relationships between different like things that have nothing to do with us. That's almost the craziest thing for me to think about. That like we're so it's hubris or just whatever as humans that we're like, well, if it doesn't harm us or hurt us, then whatever. But there's all these relationships that have absolutely zero to do with us, except that we get to observe them.
Yeah. And it's a lot of, you can be far removed from, especially invertebrates, because invertebrates have so little in common with humans that a lot of times you just kind of like shrug them off because they're so foreign to us that they seem kind of alien.
Yeah.
But they have, it just, because they're not even eating the plants, like the plants aren't what they're eating. So they're not, or when they're not herbivorous, that means that like the plants are playing into the equation of their life in like not a third party way, but it's like as a tool.
Yeah.
Like they're using the plants as a tool instead of just a food source.
Well, it's just like us using like alfalfa and hay and other plants to feed our like protein sources.
Yeah.
It's kind of the same thing. They're practicing on their own scale agriculture in a way that, again, like you said, is like kind of alien and foreign to us, but they're doing it. It's real life. Like that's really
and they're
happening.
doing it intentionally. Like it's something that over millions of years they've just evolved to do sort of innately, which I think that is the part that I can't think about too much, because if I think about it too much, it's going to stress me out. Is how like an ant that by itself has no sort of like problem solving or critical thinking capabilities, but if you get enough of them together, they can accomplish just like insanely complicated things. That's the part that I cannot deal with. Like that's the part that just starts to like blow my mind if I think too much about it. And so the last animal that I wanted to talk about is maybe a little unexpected, but this is the three-toed sloth.
Okay.
So when you look at the three-toed sloth, their fur, it is that sort of wiry, dense, matted looking fur. And most of it is like a grayish, brownish color. But you'll also see when you look at them, they kind of look green.
Yeah.
So the reason their fur looks green is because it is hosting this garden of algae. And algae is growing in their fur because of how slow they move. Like a lot of people like to kind of talk trash about the sloth because of how slow it moves, but it's moving that slow on purpose. So algae grows in their fur because of how slow they move. And there are some thoughts as to like maybe the algae is providing the sloth with some nutritional benefits, but that's like, maybe not.
Right.
So the real benefit that the algae is providing to the sloth is camouflage. So when the sloth is moving so slowly, the algae grows in its fur, it turns the sloth green. What else is green? Literally everything around them. It makes them a lot harder to see. And sloths, being so slow, are kind of easy pickings for like literally any predator big enough to fit them in their mouth.
Right.
So the camouflage is kind of their best line of defense. So they've kind of, over time, they've evolved to allow this algae to grow in their fur. So they're giving the algae, a safe place to grow. And also the algae is giving them back a line of defense against predators. And so inside of their fur, it's not just algae, it's a whole ecosystem. It's like a world inside of their fur where they've got microorganisms, they've got invertebrates, so they've got mites and beetles, and especially these types of moths that actually live in the fur of the sloth. And the moth flies around around the sloth, and it brings both like, it's thought that maybe there's some nutrition that the moth is getting from the waste of the sloth, but what the moth is bringing into this algae ecosystem is nitrogen. So the moth flies in and it flies about and brings nitrogen in that fertilizes the algae, and it just like everything is working together in this like intricately mechanical way that when you see a sloth climbing around, you're really seeing this small little world that's just crawling around in the trees, all like independently contained. It's just this little planet.
It's incredible. That's incredible. And somehow it always, like, it all comes back to poop somehow, right?
It always just boils back down to poop.
Yeah, microorganisms. I mean, I've seen The Martian. I know how it goes. But that's so fascinating. And like, and that's never in a million years why I would have. So there's a causality, right? Because I would think that they're slow, algae grows, whatever.
Right.
The fact that it actually serves a purpose, like that.
Yeah, because if it wasn't in any way, like you'll see a lot of these relationships with animals that are like not necessarily parasitic, but only one party is benefiting from it, you know?
Right.
Like maybe the algae is just growing there just because it's just an opportunity, but it's actually helping the sloth over time. So I saw something that said that it could be the case that the sloth's fur actually has adapted these like grooves and ridges in the actual fur itself, like in the actual strands, that gives the algae more opportunity to like latch on and grow on its fur. So yeah, like over time, the sloth, without I'm sure without intentionally making the decision, yes, this algae is good for me, I'm going
Right.
to allow it to grow on my fur. It just makes it a little bit harder to see for predators. And so that sloth gets to live until it has a baby. And then that baby grows algae in its fur. And they're like, maybe this is actually working out for us.
Yeah.
So that's another case of like the animal not necessarily eating the plant that it's growing, but it's serving a purpose and it's cultivating the plant because it's helping it.
Well, and I think all of this is such a good reminder that if we kind of just like leave stuff alone a little bit, nature finds balance. An ecosystem like is driven by homeostasis. So one way or the other, intended or otherwise, there's always this like intricate, just super cool balance between the host, predator, symbiotic relationships, all this. It's just so cool.
Yeah. So I was really fascinated in these ways that we're not just a dynamic where, the animal is eating the plants, but the animal is using the plant to benefit its sort of standing in the ecosystem. That was really awesome for me to do all that research. It was really fun learning about that, especially the snail, because you don't think of a snail as being particularly smart, but there they are, farming fungus on their own, intentionally. Crazy, insane to think about.
That's so crazy. I've got one of my coworkers looking in a window at me.
Hi, coworker.
He's walking off now because I called him out. So okay, let's. You said that was your last animal?
Yes, that was my last one.
So when we first started talking about doing this, you suggested maybe we cover carnivorous plants too, which I think is just so cool. So we'll jump over to these weird photosynthetic things that kind of toe the line in some ways between plant and animal. And that sounds weird to say because they are plants. They're 100% plant.
They're in the gray area, definitely.
I think so. I think they're super wild. So the one thing I'll say starting this off is, and you've mentioned this a couple of times in your discussion of animals, but everything comes back to nitrogen sources. The world is driven by nitrogen, and so the reason that we have carnivorous plants at all is because they live in really nutrient poor environments, whether it's mossy, forest floors where decomposition doesn't happen well. They've got minimal root systems. Some of them are epiphytes, which means they grow up in trees and different places. They live in bogs. They live in all these places where the soil is really poor in nutrients, primarily nitrogen. And so these plants have adapted and evolved a method of deriving nitrogen, which is one of the most important mineral nutrients to plant growth, by like catching and killing stuff, which is the same reason that we as animals catch and kill stuff. We're trying to derive nitrogen and other nutrients from it. They've been around a long time. Most of them are super ancient, but they were really described in the late 1800s, about 1875, by Charles Darwin. He wrote a book called Insectivorous Plants.
Wow.
And it was one of the first big like collections of information on these things. they have a weird like history and evolution. They've actually evolved independently in 5 different orders. We think 9 or 10 times. They've got like 10 different genera, 600-ish species. And so like it turns out that harvesting insects or harvesting other um, organisms is a really efficient way across the board in independent evolution to derive a nitrogen source, which is, the reason we do it. We eat other stuff because it's an efficient way to get nitrogen and other nutrients. So, I don't know how much you know about them. I know you said you were super interested in them.
I am, and I know next to nothing. I know about the Venus flytrap. In that I'm aware it exists, and I know like a little bit about its capture mechanism, and then I'm aware of the pitcher plant, and those are the two that I'm just kind of I'm aware of how they work in the sense that I know how they catch the prey, but that's the end of my knowledge.
Okay. Well, no, and that's I'm glad you say that, because that is honestly what most people think.
Mm-hmm.
When you say carnivorous plant, everyone's thinking, oh yeah, Venus flytrap, right? Or the monkey paw or any other like pitcher plant that gets sold in garden centers and people have in their houses and all of that. It turns out that so there's 5 different categories that these plants are typically broken down into. There's pitfall traps, which are pitcher plants, fly paper traps, snap traps, which would be like your Venus flytrap, bladder traps, and lobster traps.
Oh my gosh.
Or eel traps. So there's super, and the more I dug into it, the more it freaked me out a little bit. You've seen Little Shop of Horrors, right? With it's an old movie where there's like a monster plant that this guy grows.
I haven't seen it. I'm so sorry. I'm a small baby.
Oh, that's right. I forget that I'm old.
No, I'm just an infant child.
So, well, your homework is to go watch. It's really funny. But anyway, so the whole premise of this movie is that he gets this plant that turns out it kind of looks like the piranha plants from Mario. Eats people.
Okay, now you got me.
Yeah, so if you think of a piranha plant, you've pretty much the plant's named Audrey. So if you think of a piranha plant that's the size of a school bus, you've got Audrey from Little Shop of Horrors.
I love her.
And it's hilarious. Anyway, but that's what people think, right? Because of pop culture, they think of something that's a snap trap that like essentially looks like a mouth that eats something.
Yeah, and I always, since like for the longest time I had never actually seen one in person, and I had only seen them in like cartoons and video games and stuff, I assumed they were enormous.
Oh yeah, no, they're tiny.
They were huge, but no, they're and then when I saw one in real life and it's like the size of like the tip of my thumb, I was like, oh, they eat bugs. Bugs are not that big. They don't actually have to be that big.
Yeah, well, no, and it's funny because it's almost disappointing the first time. You're like, oh, is this it? Really? Like I was thinking.
This is the Venus flytrap. It's like 2 inches long.
I was thinking bear trap, but yeah. No, and so that's it's really interesting because they have these cilia, these little hairs on the edges of their leaves that kind of weave themselves together and trap the insect. But if you look at the 2 halves of the leaves, the pads, they have these little trigger hairs. And an insect actually has to touch 2 of them. So they'll walk across it, they will grab, they'll put their foot on one, they'll put their foot on another, and then that trap snaps closed. But they're actually designed or evolved to have pretty fairly large gaps between these leaf hairs or these leaf tips that weave together. So because once it closes the pad, that's it. It knits together, it digests the plant, and it digests the insect, produces a new pad. So they don't want to catch tiny, tiny little insects that don't provide a lot of nutrition. And so there's actually gaps big enough that most really, really small insects, think like fruit flies or tiny little ants, can escape. But larger insects that actually make a good meal, so to speak, don't. Because it's all about efficiency, right? They're in places where they do photosynthesize. They are photosynthetic plants, but it costs a lot of energy to digest these insects. So they want to make the most out of every catch that they can. Which I think we see in animal predators too, right? Like,
yeah. Sometimes it's just not worth it.
Yeah, and they may get one meal every couple of weeks, so they want the biggest, most efficient meal they can, right? So there's prey that they will go after, and there's prey that they won't. So that's one kind, is these snap traps, which I think is what most people are familiar with. The most common ones are these pitfall traps that are pitcher plants, and essentially they look like a pitcher or like a stomach almost. And there's some that grow out of the ground. There some that are epiphytic that hang their pitchers. Like monkey paw is one of the most common ones that I think people see a lot. But essentially, they produce a sugar water that attracts insects. They kind of wander on there. They fall in. It's essentially like falling into a stomach where there's digestive juices and they're broken down and absorbed by the plant. It's almost a little like gruesome, right? It's a little ghoulish that they're attracting insects and digesting them alive.
I know, it's devious.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is the most like sinister plant.
Oh, absolutely, yes. And it's interesting because you were talking about depositing excrement. There is a pitcher plant that has developed this relationship with a little rodent in the rainforest, and I can't remember now what the name of the rodent is. I'll probably put a little aside in with the species name. But essentially, it produces these sugary substances instead of down in the pitcher, up around the rim of the plant, just under what we would consider a lid. And so this rodent comes up and laps up or drinks the sugar water and then deposits excrement down into the pitcher of the plant. And instead of having to catch insects, it uses that as a nitrogen source. So it's developed this symbiotic relationship with this rodent. Where it provides the sugar, that source of carbohydrates, and in return gets nitrogen in sort of a passive way.
This pitcher plant has all of its bases covered.
Yeah, they've got it figured out.
They have so many like dietary options.
Oh yeah, yeah, and so they've got to figure out, and when I say the plant thought this or did this, obviously I'm
just natural selection did this over millions of years.
right. But it's easier sometimes to think about it like, oh, the plant wanted to have a rodent poop in it. I don't know. It's weird.
Well, you can think about things like in terms of like, yes, the plant wants this because this is what's beneficial to the plant, even though the plant might not be like having conscious thoughts about, yes, I want that thing. Like,
right.
It wants in a more like zoomed out conceptual way.
Right, for sure. Well, so there's a couple other types of carnivorous plants that I wanted to mention just real quickly, just kind of watching the time. I won't ramble as much as I normally do. But there's some that are called flypaper traps. And one common example of this is called a sundew, a drosera. And I don't know if you've seen these, but they have these long, like, tentacle-like leaves that essentially look like they have little sticky lollipops on them.
Oh my gosh.
It almost looks like if you were to think of like an octopus's tentacle that has little suction cups, except they're like facing all directions, right?
Okay, I'm looking at a picture of it now.
It's kind of wild looking, isn't it?
It's very complicated to look at, but it's very psychedelic.
It is. And so they just put like on the tips of those little antennae looking structures, the little bead that you see there, the little clear drop is sugar water.
Yeah. It's sugar water.
And so a fly comes up and it's like, hey, this smells good. I want to, or an insect comes up, I want to, drink this. And then it essentially gets stuck. And then the leaf of the drosera slowly curls up around that insect and digests it kind of in place.
That's so horrifying.
It's horrifying.
Is like some Artax style, like the pit of despair or whatever, like the mud pit that the horse gets stuck in at the beginning of the Never-Ending Story.
Oh my gosh, yes, exactly. the swamp of sadness.
Yeah.
See, we're talking the same language here.
I just made that up.
No, that's a good one too. Or like it's like a sarlacc pit or something like that, and it's crazy. But yeah, so these are actually fairly common. These are not too hard to find. The two that are really interesting that you're not going to see in the industry very much because they're mostly aquatic are bladder traps or bladderworts and lobster pot traps. So bladder traps are pretty much what they sound like. It is a bladder that has a small opening that has a hinged door that actually creates a vacuum. And so it actively pulls water down into the bladder of this plant. It's an osmotic potential kind of thing, but it's actively moving water through the bladder of this plant. And essentially, invertebrates and other, algae, different kinds of things get literally sucked into the plant by active movement. And then the little door closes and they get digested.
Oh my gosh. So that is very similar to the feeding mechanics that we've talked about some aquatic predators.
Right.
So what's interesting is that if you're trying to catch something in your mouth underwater, if you just push forward in the water, you could push the water forward with you, which then pushes the prey away from you.
Right.
So a lot of times that's not necessarily the best option. Just like pushing forward with your mouth open isn't always gonna, like, that could do you more harm than good. So like we talked about, like the axolotl is
Right,
one
yeah.
that rather than just pushing forward, it actually will get up close to its prey and then open its mouth very, very quickly, which creates a vacuum that sucks all of the water with their prey into their mouth. But like that's something that the axolotl is doing, like with its body, with its muscles, and this is a plant that's doing it. That's really it. That's mind blowing.
It's crazy. They essentially make an ion gradient and just actively through, like, I don't know, aggressive osmosis, like move water through the plant. It's pretty crazy. And then the last one I'll mention, and these are not super common, but it's called a lobster pot trap. And it's pretty much exactly what it sounds like. There's an opening that prey will, it's kind of like a funnel shaped leaf that prey will swim down into and to try to, either escape or get some kind of nutrition. And then there's inward facing hairs that keep the insect or the prey from swimming back out. So essentially they go in one direction and get trapped and can't get back out.
Wow.
It's crazy stuff because, like, and what's funny, and I wanted to mention this as I was doing some research on this, I just Googled carnivorous plants to try to find a couple of resources. And one of the top questions on Google is, can a carnivorous plant eat a human?
Well,
technically, yes.
I mean, if the human was like, I don't know if it's too brutal for the show, but like if the human was like divided up into insect-sized pieces, maybe.
Sure. Yeah. Or if they somehow got, like, if you think about like prehistoric megaflora, there probably were some of these plants at some point in our history, since they are fairly primitive plants in some ways, in terms of roots and a few other stuff, that probably could eat, I'm not going to say megafauna, but things that are bigger than an insect. I've seen videos of little frogs getting caught even now by Venus flytraps and stuff like that.
And back in back in, prehistoric times, insects were that big. Like you could have seen like dragonflies the size of your arm, like bugs were huge back then. So I'm sure that with bugs being that big and insects being that big, that probably also translated to a plant big enough to eat it.
Yeah, exactly. And we talk about a lot that, evolution's an arms race in a lot of ways. And if a plant has to be big enough to eat its prey, it'll figure out how to be big enough, so to speak, or evolve in a way so that it's big enough. I think it's just really fascinating. And it, if you think about it too hard, could keep you up at night a little bit. But so
yeah, I have to kind of remind myself, like, don't dive too deep. It's okay. Leave it alone.
Yeah, just don't think about it too hard. But yes, to all the Googlers out there that have made this their top question, you don't really have to worry about it because these plants are generally pretty small. But technically, yes, if you somehow manage to fall your way into a pitcher plant, it could eat you. So just keep an eye out. I don't know. Don't be too distracted by sugar water that's down in a giant pitcher somewhere. But so that's pretty much what I had. But yeah, no, I'm glad you came up with that idea to talk about carnivorous plants because they're wild.
I feel like this has been a very enriching exchange of information. I feel like because my idea was that like I would come in and represent the animal kingdom and then you could represent the plant kingdom. And it's just the crossover event of the century. And, because like I feel like carnivorous plants are that sort of gray area where you're like, they're kind of bridging the gap between the animal and plant kingdom. So it's at the point where you're like, what counts?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And the more you study about different species and different genera, the less any of those words actually mean anything, right? Like the more, like, there's so much more gray area out there the deeper you dive into biology than we realize. And it's just kind of fun to get to talk about some of these things that toe that line just a little bit.
I actually, within the last 7 days, had to Google for myself whether an anemone was an animal or a plant because I could not remember, and they are an animal, and that surprised me.
Well, yeah, I don't think I could have pulled that off the top of my head either. I'd have been like, I don't know. They're weird little.
Yeah, so there are a lot of animals that start to toe that line between animal and plant as well. So,
well, no, that's super cool, and I really appreciate you coming on and chatting with me about this. It's for me, it's been super interesting. I've really enjoyed this.
Me too. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this. This has been a lot of fun. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity.
So to kind of wrap up, plug your stuff. Let me know, or let our listeners know where we can find you, how often you release episodes, merch, whatever else you want to talk about.
Oh, yeah. So once again, our podcast is called Just the Zoo of Us. It is a clean, family-friendly, safe for work podcast, except for when we talk about like predation and reproductive habits and stuff like that.
Sure.
Nothing graphic or anything, but I think you'd be safe listening to it at work or around kids. We're available on like all the major podcatchers. Shouldn't be too hard to find us. We have a website, justtthezooofus.com, that should point you in all the right directions. We are on Facebook. We have a Facebook group that's pretty lit. I know you are in it, and it is a lot of fun. We are on Twitter, and we're also on Instagram. I will admit that I'm less active on Instagram, so Twitter and Facebook are probably the best ways to find us. Yeah, that's about it. I think just come hang out with us in the virtual space and talk about animals with us.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So plant people, go be animal people. You will not regret listening to the show. I promise.
And as an animal person, I have enjoyed being converted to being a plant person.
Oh, that's like the best feedback I could possibly give. I really appreciate that.
That I'm a crossover. I wouldn't say no. So I haven't left the animal crowd behind in favor of the plant realm, but I've definitely been brought around.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much again for being on. I really enjoyed it, and I can't wait for people to hear this here in a few weeks.
No problem. Thanks so much.
Y'all, thanks so much, as always, for listening. You know that I love you people and that you make this whole thing worth doing. And thanks again to Ellen for talking to me all those many, many months ago when the world was a different kind of strange. But I hope y'all are doing well and staying safe. I hope you are vaccinated. I hope you are living life well. Okay. And thanks again, as always, to the Texas Tech Department of Plant and Soil Science for all the support. Thanks for those of you that support on Patreon. If you would like to do the thing, head over to patreon.com/planthropology. Follow on social media. Again, look up Planthropology or Planthropology Pod, depending on where you're looking. Join the Planthropology's Cool Plant People Facebook group, and look me up on TikTok. I am at the Plant Prof for some reason. So again, I hope y'all are great. We'll be back in 2 weeks on the third Tuesday. We're kind of getting back to a regular schedule where I talk to a professor here at Texas Tech named Dr. Brian Gemza, who is trying to bring back lost varieties of apples. And y'all are really, really going to love that one. I love you folks. We'll talk soon.